Thank you everybody for joining. My name is Mikey Mhenna. I'm going to be moderating the Q&A at the end of the session. I'm very, very pleased to be joined by Ahmad Damen, who's going to be, who is a member of our community, who's going to be answering the question, how to listen to world music from a Middle Eastern perspective. So everybody, I'm going to pass over to Ahmad. Welcome, Ahmad. We'll give you a round of applause. Thank you very much for coming. Take it away.
Okay, again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Mike and the afikra team for hosting me tonight. And I'm going to talk about how to listen from a Middle Eastern perspective when it comes to world music or music of the world. So we already got through the beginning part. So I am not an expert, but I promise that I tried to learn as much as I could to satisfy my curiosity about this topic. Someone here might know more about it than me, so please correct me, ask questions, and contribute. But do it nicely, if you may. And I'm not trying to persuade you of my agenda or convince you to take action. My only hope is that my presentation will cultivate your own curiosities. So what is it that led me to this? Passion for music. I've been in music for more than 20 years now, professionally for 10 years. I compose music for film, composed for around 20 documentaries and independent films and TV projects. Professionally, also, I recorded for other artists, played as a solo in concerts, and collaborated with, believe it or not, world music bands. I played with musicians from India, Africa, Brazil, and other countries. Second, my love for research. When I wanted to do my research in business for my master's, I actually did it about an opera house. So it had to be about a music business, which was surprising to my supervisor. But when you love music, everything becomes about music, I guess. And the last but not least, when I used to work at Birzeit University in Palestine, and I produced a podcast about world music, which really intrigued me to discuss the subject with you tonight. So I know it sounds cliche to start with a definition, but bear with me. What is world music? Now, if I go to Google quickly and type world music and search, one of the first few links that would come up would be this one which is kind of colloquial a bit, from the Oxford Learner's Dictionary. And it says traditional music from non-Western countries, sometimes including elements of Western popular music. And that kind of gives an impression of what is viewed as world music. Anything that's non-Western and does not also can follow the Western popular music, but also anything that doesn't fit the genre that is known in world music, like rock or pop or jazz. Now, in a more academic sense, we have the world of ethnomusicology. It started as comparative musicology, which is Western pioneers would find indigenous people during the exploration age. They're interested and they see something different, so they want to compare it to something that they already know, which is Western music theory. Now, in the 1950s, this started to change a bit, because when ethnomusicology developed, they said, hey, no, we want to study and research this music organically. It's in its own environment without this influence or bias. But it continues today to be a comparative study, because most of the researchers come from a Western background. So they have this kind of preconceived idea of what music is when they look at music of the world. So what is the reality of world music today? I found this interesting textbook from 2 years ago, which is one of the textbooks being given to students in universities as part of ethnomusicology. And in page 6, when they talk about the section discussing European music, they say, we consider specific qualities of European and by association North American musical practices normal. So consciously and unconsciously, our approaches and viewpoints reflect this background, which we already talked about, but they still admit it in an academic sense today. And second, when it comes to marketing and sales, 7 Western corporations control 50 to 90% of the market share in all countries when it comes to music. I mean here, of course, music labels. And any non-Western style of music is categorized as world music, no matter how different it is. So what does that mean for the artist? That means 2 things. First, higher profit margins for the corporations than other more Western genres. And second, less perks, exclusive deals, and promotions for this kind of music, which anything that falls under the umbrella of world music as a term, as a genre. So I thought to myself, why don't I look at world music, but from a Middle Eastern perspective? How am I supposed to listen to world music and do the same kind of comparison, but knowing my culture and where I am and where does this music come from? And especially that we know that there has been great cultural influence from the Silk Road. So when it comes to the location of the Middle East, especially if we look at the old world, quote unquote, I know this is not the best term to describe it, but we know this term, all of us know this term. And we look at the location of the Middle East, it's kind of in the middle, which is, from its name, it's very apparent that it connects all the different parts of the map in a way, and that's why Europe depended on the Middle East in its trade and to connect to India and China. And while when we look at Europe, we can see it on the edge of the map in comparison. And that's very much reflected when it comes to pitch and structure of the musical scale. So we are all, or I guess most of us or some of us are familiar with the Western musical scale or the chromatic scale. So the chromatic scale, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, is actually made of 12 different sounds or 12 different notes that make a chromatic scale on a piano. Let's take a listen. So all of these notes are the notes that you can play on a Western piano today, or I guess maybe a harpsichord in the classical times. And I try to portray it as this kind of funny looking pie where you can see how these sounds are distributed. If I look at the Middle Eastern scale, and I say here Middle Eastern, not only Arab, because I'm including also Persian music and Turkish music, there are additional notes which are known as the quarter tone. And the quarter tone gives the Middle East its special sound, its flavor. It's not the only thing that characterizes Middle Eastern music, of course, but it's one of the main things that gives it its sound. And if anyone is not familiar with what the quarter tone is, it sounds something like this. So this is like a quick example of the rust, which is like the equivalent in Middle Eastern music of C major, or the main music the main scale that you would kind of go through and explore when you think about what Middle Eastern music is. Now, when it comes to Indian music takes this to a totally different level when it comes to how much is the frequency being used. And an example of this is the Indian raga. And if we listen to this well-known Indian artist, please notice how he thinks about the frequency and how much he bends the strings of the sitar while he's playing. So again, in this example, we are using almost all the frequencies that we can use in a scale. And that gives the Middle Eastern music this kind of interesting position right in the middle. If we compare it again, the Western classical scale with its kind of like structured notes, and then look at the Middle Eastern scale, the notes are still kind of separate in a similar way, but there are more notes, more sounds, more use of the frequency. And then we go to India, and there is the most used frequencies in a scale. So this is an interesting way to look at how these different musics are thought of and connected. This collaboration, or this kind of interaction between the Middle East and India, produced things like Qawwali, a kind of music that combines Indian rhythms with Middle Eastern or Sufi music. Or, for example, when it comes to rhythms, in many Khaliji or Arabic Gulf rhythms, there are Indian influences. In the Middle East, there are many rhythms that we call Indian rhythms because they come from India. And also the improvisational style is similar. So the raga is an improvisational style when it's performed, very similar to the Middle Eastern taqasim or taqsim. Now, let's play a little game when it comes to musical instruments. I'm going to play a video, and I would ask you to close your eyes for 5 seconds while you're listening, and then open them. And while you're closing your eyes, try to imagine what does music sound like, what kind of visual is it, and then compare it with reality. Okay, so I'm going to start now. So this instrument is called the ruwan, and you might have guessed that it sounds very similar to the oud. And that's because this instrument was developed during the time when the Silk Road was at its peak. And this is how the ruwan came to be. And it's part of classical Chinese music. It's not some instrument that is made in the 20th century. And there are several similarities when it comes to timbre, or the way the musical instruments are made. We find similarities between the oud and the ruwan. There is the jose, which is popular in Iraq. You can find variations of it in some Asian countries, also Western Asian countries, and Persia, Turkey, and the erhu, the Chinese erhu. The same with the qanun and the guzheng. So when it comes to Chinese music, we think of it in a certain way, but actually there are more similarities, more collaborations that happened over time that we're not very familiar with. We don't get to know about when we discuss Chinese music and the way it influenced and was influenced by Middle Eastern music. When it comes to African music, I didn't think that it's necessary to explain how African music and Middle Eastern music is related, because half of the Arab world is in Africa, so it's kind of redundant. But I found this interesting song from the recent uprisings and revolution that happened in Sudan, and It's originally sung by the well-known oudist and singer, composer Ibrahim al-Kashif. And it literally says, I'm African and Sudanese. And this kind of gives the flavor of what it means to produce the colorful and beautiful thing that is Sudanese music today, combining African music, African rhythm, and Arabic music. Let's take a listen. Now, something that I left towards the end, which is the obvious comparisons and the obvious relationship between Middle Eastern music and Europe. This is the one subject that has gotten most of the research and attention from Western musicians, because they compare Western music to music of the world. So there is abundance of research when it comes to the influence. We are all familiar with Andalusia, the Spanish influence that happened for 800 years. And there is a table on the right side here that shows the Spanish name of some instruments and the Arabic origin and what the English meaning is. Also, there is much debate, and it's not decided yet, on whether the troubadour, which is romantic French songs that came out after the end of the medieval era and the dark ages of Europe, that it's actually coming from the words tarabidour, or kind of romantic songs in Arabic. But there is much debate about it, but it's all academic. So there is a strong theory supporting that, but we are not 100% sure, but it seems plausible. I also wanted to highlight something important here, and that there is a give and take thing. We always want to, as Middle Easterns, want to think about the things that we give, but there is also many things we take. When it comes to the Ottoman Empire, what we consider in our classical music, the longas, they're actually coming from the Balkan region. And the Ottomans took this kind of Balkanese or Balkan dance, and they made it into what we know today as longa. So the Ottomans kind of took everything in and incorporated as part of the empire, as part of the culture and music of the whole empire. So this is something I think is essential to keep in mind, that this is a give and take relationship. I enjoyed reading this book and World Music, A Global Journey, and in page 221, they even say here, European music in particular would be unthinkable without Arabic music. So this is something to ponder and think about, how the two music of the worlds collaborated. And this is kind of personal for me, but it's interesting to see that by the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 20th century, when Western composers wanted to explore more sound, knowing how structured the music is, how they think about the notes, the first thing that they started experimenting with was quarter tones, which is a defining factor of Middle Eastern music. So it was kind of a second step for them to go beyond that to Indian, Chinese, African music. But the first thing that they wanted, in order to experiment with sound, they went to quarter tones. Now, Western music is very different. This presentation is mainly about classical music. Western music now is atonal, so they think about frequencies, all frequencies. They don't think about them as notes in the way that classical music did. But this is, I think, an important observation of how Western music developed over time. So to answer the question, how to listen from a Middle Eastern perspective, I think it's important to understand that there are many similarities and mutual exchange that happens between Middle Eastern music and Indian music, Chinese music, several parts of African music, including the East Coast, West Coast and Mali Empire, for example, huge influence, and European music. And all of these are part of what makes music today of the Middle East what it is, and how it compares and collaborates with the rest of the world. And this is something that I'm passionate about, and it's something that there is not much research to discuss, because most of the research is Western music based in comparison to other musics of the world. And I would encourage you to look at these further readings. There are much more talk about, for example, globalization and the effect it had on world music. I couldn't include for time today, but I think is very interesting. And I really would love to find, if you do, please send me more research when it comes to looking at Middle Eastern music and how it compares to the other music of the world that's not necessarily Western or Western based. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the talk today. If you want to check more about the research that I did or I'm doing on world music and the music compositions that I've done, please visit my website, Ahmad Damen at github.io, or please feel free to contact me directly, and here is my email. And with that, I will give the mic back to Mike.
Thanks, Ahmad. Thank you so much. That was great. If you can keep your screen shared, because I'd love to go back for a second.
Sure.
I'll start out with my first question, and then there's a few questions to in the chat. I'm always interested in terms like Middle Eastern music, right? Because the Middle East geographically is very wide. What do you think are the defining features of quote unquote Middle Eastern music, and how useful is that term when you talk about music coming from a very diverse region?
Yeah, so there are, of course, many similarities between different Arabic countries. As shown in the presentation, Sudanese music has its own sound. They use the pentatonic scale, for example, in addition to other scales in music. Khaliji music is distinctive. Music from North Africa, Morocco, Algeria is distinctive, but there are also many similarities, and that similarity is also applied to Persian music, Turkish music, sharing instruments, sharing sounds, sharing many. I would say that the music is distinctively similar. This is how I would describe it, and it's what makes it distinctly similar is the timbre, the use of similar instruments, the use of quarter tones, the use of the way for example, when we say takht al-sharqi, actually takht is an Iranian or Persian word, and it means the throne or something like that, and it's like where the musicians would kind of sit and play the music. So this mentality of what creates a Middle Eastern music band, for example, what kind of instruments, what kind of also what kind of compositions, and how the introductions for singers are introduced. They are very similar across the whole Middle East. These are, like, I would say, defining factors when it comes to looking at Middle Eastern music as one thing.
I was asking, are there any studies that show how the Middle Eastern music has changed in post-colonial studies, or anything that changed in the music after colonialism in the Middle East?
Mm-hmm. So this is a very interesting question. I didn't want to go into this subject particularly because I'm thinking more about what classical music is. It's also would be interesting to think about whether we think of the Ottoman Empire as part of the region, part of the Arabic music, or is it not? There are many things that we can think about, because the Ottoman influence was huge when it comes to what Middle Eastern music, what we understand as classical Middle Eastern music today, how they incorporated Armenian music, European music, Persian music, Middle Eastern music, and created a hub in which Istanbul was the center of that culture, let's say, that distributed music to all parts of the empire. When it comes to colonialism or the colonial power, British, French, and so on, of course, there has been a lot of influence that we are still feeling today, which is similar to what we see in globalization. In the same way that culture is pushed by the colonial power in terms of language, in terms of ways of life, in ways of what's high standards, what's low standard, that also affected music. And that's what we see today in the Middle East, in which many families are interested in teaching their children instruments like the Western guitar, the piano, and so on, while there hasn't been as, like, it depends, but I would say from many, and this is not like academic, but from personal experience, many young people that I met in the Middle East, or even people my age and older, they look at the oud, the qanun, and the Middle Eastern music, and they would say things like, it's sad music, it's old music, it's not music relevant to the age. So this is something that's very peculiar, because it kind of, I would say that we can argue that maybe this could be a colonization influence in how do we perceive and look at our own music compared to the music of the powerful, music of the Western world, and so on.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Dima. Dima,
Hi,
do you
thanks
want
for
to
the
unmute yourself?
presentation. So regarding the analogy between the instruments, the three instruments from the Middle East and from China, is it like the strongest link in the number of analogous musical instruments between us and China? Or do we have the same, let's say, we can find the same instruments in, say, Africa, or because you showed these very strong visual similarities with the Chinese instruments?
Absolutely. I mean, there are, I would say, I mean, it depends how you look at it. So it's kind of an organic thing where there are, like, I saw or see many similarities in Chinese music. You can see influences in Indian music too. There are Indian instruments that are, I do not remember the name, but I've seen or heard Indian instruments that are also similar in the same way to the oud and the qanun and so on. When it comes to African music, I would say that I am not personally aware when it comes to, like, Central African music. When I see their instruments, they're distinctively different. They sound different, but they also influenced our music in a different way. And maybe it's because of the geographical barriers. For example, the Great Saharan Desert didn't allow for as much, let's say, interaction when it comes to exchanging musical instruments. But this is something that you or anyone else would be interested in, can find more information on. I do think that when it comes to Europe, to Asia, the examples are more apparent. They are more like in your face. But I'm sure that the same would apply to different cultures from around the world.
Thank you.
One last question from Tom. Tom Wentz, you want to unmute yourself?
Hey, Damen, it's Tom.
Hey.
Just a quick question. And I know, I understand the idea between the oral traditions or just played music versus like actual written music. But my question is more specific to around which century did Middle Eastern music begin written music? Are there similar like Eastern and Western timelines for the beginnings of written and thereby the proliferation of said music?
Absolutely. So actually, when it comes to Eastern and Western music, I think that they had been different writing systems that started around different times. Middle Eastern music maybe have started writing music, not in the way notations are today, but writing music in a communicative way at earlier instances, because like the rise of civilizations in the Middle East happened earlier. So this is something to keep in mind, but there have been many systems. One of the most well-known systems when it comes to Middle Eastern music is the system started by Al-Farabi, I think, in his Kitab al-Musiqa al-Kabir, the big book on music, in which he introduced a writing and notation system of his own. There has been others by mathematicians and physicians of the Middle East during the golden ages of the Arabic and Islamic Empire. There has been also like documented notation systems, particularly the, I forgot his name, but there is a famous Armenian composer that came up with his own notation system that was adopted by the Ottoman Empire. And it's very different from the Western notation system. And that system was the official system in the empire. And ironically enough, this goes back to Majid's question about colonization. It's only after colonization that the Middle East was introduced to the Western notation system that we know today, which happens to be the G clef, F clef, the different dots on the line, and so on and so forth. So I think that when it comes to oral tradition, the oral tradition has been a strong factor of what Middle Eastern music is, especially in Arabic countries. When it comes to folklore music, the Ottomans kind of took control of the music rotation and writing notation, defining what classical music is in the region. So they did not, let's say they did not support, or they did not care as much about folklore music in different pockets or hubs in the Arab world. And that music was much more oral for a much longer time until they were kind of allowed, or they had opportunities to record music or write music in order to preserve it for generations.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So we're going to take, I think, one last question. I think Ahmed has a question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thanks, Ahmed. That's a great presentation. Thanks, Mikey. It's really just a continuation of Mikey's question here. Like, if we were, the Middle Eastern music seems to be defined in very absolute terms. And say if I was Nubian or Sudanese, and I'm listening to music from my perspective, and I'm used to the pentatonic scale, would that classify as an answer to a question? Like wouldn't the pentatonic scale that you played, that you shared with us, would that classify as Middle Eastern music to you? And if not, then why does it not qualify? Thanks a lot again for the presentation.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. That's a very good question that I ponder personally, and I thought about before, and I think that it definitely is. I don't know why not. It's distinctive. It takes, because I'm not sure that when it comes to Middle Eastern music, we're looking at absolute terms or absolute things. Maybe there are certain, let's say, artists or bands or patterns of thought that had more exposure than others, but overall, I would say that it's very fluid. And when you listen to Persian music, especially today, it's kind of very similar than music that you would listen to in Syria. The same would apply to music that you would listen to in Mauritania or Sudan. There are clear differences in sound. So trying to kind of bring everything together and create a thing, an umbrella under which Middle Eastern music would be today, is kind of similar when it comes to language, to culture. Like, do we think about it as like formal language, as Fusha, and what do we share? Or is it the local words, the colloquial words and accents and patterns of speech that has developed over time that makes every region distinct on its own? It's a very tricky question, and to be honest, I'm not sure that I know the answer to it. I personally consider Nubian music to be part of the Middle Eastern music. It's it didn't get as much exposure as it deserves. Maybe some artists did make it into the glamour light of Egypt and Cairo and appeared in some films and did some songs and albums, but is there more room for different kinds of music to, especially in the Middle East, to find its spotlight? Definitely, for sure. When it comes to music, and this is a personal opinion of mine, when it comes to music, Middle Easterns, Arabs in particular, are not that good when it comes to promoting music, marketing their music in the world, presenting their music in the world, and thinking about how to cultivate that culture in future generations. I would say that personally, I don't think that we are doing a good job at all.
Ahmed, if you don't mind playing a little bit of music just to end the presentation, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. I think I was going to play today. Maybe we can play a longa from the well-known Egyptian composer Riyad al-Sumbati.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining. I hope you enjoy your Saturday afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Stay peaceful, stay curious, power, love, peace. See y'all later.